Hi everyone, my name is Michael and I'm just a Kansas boy. Today I'm going to be reacting to a video by Swaney, who actually created the video that I recorded several weeks ago about the history of Finland. And it was a really interesting, really entertaining video. And a lot of you were in the comments telling me things, different insights, a few corrections, and all of that. And I loved that. And so I'm going to react to another one of their videos today. This one is about the history of Sweden. I don't know much about Sweden, probably know a little bit more than Finland, but I do think that this one might contain some information about Vikings. So that will be interesting. Now, I do have some Swedish heritage myself. It's probably roughly half of my heritage, and so I'm looking forward to learning more about this. And those of you who are from Sweden or know a lot about it, please get in the comments and share your thoughts and ideas and insights. I'd love to hear them.
3 magic ingredients are needed to make an empire: food to sustain a population, technology to access the resources you have, and the means of acquiring the resources you don't. Okay, there's more to it than that, but we're trying to be thematic here. In the age of the nation-state, empire can be seen as pretty antiquated, but for most of human history, empire was the rule, not the exception. You have to figure out a way to get the resources and food you need, because sometimes pickled herring just won't cut it. Ugh. Ice receded from this part of the...
By the way, I'm wondering if he's going to mention lutefisk at all. That's something that my grandmother used to make, and I wasn't the biggest fan of it. Let's just say that.
The world at the end of the last glacial period. Successive waves of fishing hunter-gatherers, farmers, and eventually migrating steppe herders called these lands home, the latter of which brought the Indo-European language family and bronze to Scandinavia. These would soon develop into the Proto-Germanic people. Their farming technology was pretty sophisticated. However, one thing you'll notice about Sweden is that it's bloody cold and heavily forested, meaning farmland wasn't exactly easy to come by. So settlements tended to be modest fishing villages. These coastal towns made it far easier to fish, obviously, but perhaps more importantly, easier to trade over the Baltic. Grains and vegetables that couldn't be grown could now be easily transported from markets further south, thus fulfilling all 3 ingredients and sustaining a growing population. Welcome to the Swaney channel, where trade is fun. Now, these weren't the only settlers of Fennoscandia. No. From the other direction arrived a completely separate group in at least 2 successive migrations, bringing with them the Fenno-Ugric languages. These were herders who followed the reindeer migration patterns and lived a primarily nomadic life similar to their ancestors. They would become the Sami, and their land is called Sapmi. They are distantly related to their cousins the Finns.
I was going to ask if that's who they were, and lo and behold, they were. I just did a video on that earlier. You can check it out if you want to.
And their land is called Sapmi. They are distantly related to their cousins the Finns, and although they sometimes got lumped together with names like Finns or Lappa in Swedish, that's now fallen mostly out of favor because of its association with folks of, a more colonial persuasion. Anyway, by this point you've probably realized that there's a problem. If you're almost completely reliant on trade, then what happens in times of famine or poor harvests? Well, as is human nature, during harsh times, the only option you really have is to raid and plunder for the food you need. And on the coasts, this means hopping in your boat, pillaging the neighboring village, or otherwise succumbing to starvation, and then they would have to hop in their boats and do the same thing. And pretty soon, a culture of raiding became very important to survival.
So that's really interesting. I'd always wondered how the Viking culture got started, and it sounds like it's because there wasn't really a lot of farmland, and so this was about survival, which makes sense. That's why humans do a lot of things, right?
Magnify this out on a larger scale and it should start to sound familiar. That's because it's exactly what characterized the Viking Age centuries later. And yes, hunting and fishing played a role here too, but the technology that allows you to actively both fish, trade, and raid is the boat. Shipbuilding was immensely important to these folks, almost deity-like, and it represents an overwhelming majority of the stone carvings we have from this era. Now let's just be really clear for a second. Raiding didn't replace trade here. It merely acted to supplant the resource deficits in times when it was needed. And so, in a way, the two worked in tandem to supply their population rather than relying on just one. And we can see examples of this throughout the written record. The Roman Empire collapsed at the hands of the Germanic invasions, famously during the late Antiquity Ice Age when access to food was becoming a bigger problem, and Germanic tribes eventually scaled up these raids in response to those increased pressures. The Great Migration Period.
I really like this video because it goes way more in depth than the Finland video does. I think this is one of the newer ones, and I love that level of depth. It's really cool.
Probably remember one of those tribes, the Goths, also called the Gates and possibly also the Jutes, but not all of them were off pillaging Rome. Most of them, in fact, stayed in their homeland, Sweden, forming one of its first political structures during the Iron Age.
I didn't know the Goths were from Sweden.
A brief lull occurred after these migrations, which makes sense, sometimes called the Vendel period, probably a time when Norse religion and poetry was becoming more like what we know it today. But as the population rose and the Svea tribe consolidated in the north, the need to raid came again. This was the Viking Age. Now, I know it may seem as though the Viking Age sort of came out of nowhere, but that's not really the case at all. The preceding centuries had seen these Old Norse people creating immense trade routes through the Baltic, even all the way down to the lands of Byzantium. The Viking raiders were merely following these already established routes, expanding them and taking advantage of undefended villages wherever they could. These Swedish Vikings became known to the Slavs as the Rus, meaning rowing men, and they came to absolutely dominate the peoples they encountered, raiding, trading, plundering, settling, building, you name it. Byzantine emperors even hired them as bodyguards called Varangians, which means something like sworn mercenary and shows the great diversity of Viking professions. And these Vikings got super wealthy. It's all part of the reason we have this brutal Viking caricature in our pop culture, because at the end of the day, these pillagers were in fact pagans raiding Christian lands, and so tales and myth persisted of their tyranny both in Norse sagas and runestones and in Christian records.
Someone mentioned that in the last video. They said that the Vikings weren't necessarily any more brutal than, well, things were brutal back then. And so part of the reason that they were branded that way is because they were non-Christian and pagan. So this reinforces that.
The Vikings were more than happy to feed into that narrative because really it made their job easier if it meant that they could get their plunder without a fight.
True.
The myth was kind of the point. We do have elaborate Viking burials which shows just how important being a warrior was to these people, but most Norsemen were merchants, not Vikings. And your average Viking themselves would just as often turn to stealth, extortion, bribery, or good old-fashioned hired wages to get the loot they wanted. Why risk fighting when losing even one battle could be a death sentence? Vikings often had rivalries with other Vikings, so you kind of had to pick your battles. The whole thing was like a multitude of mafia gangs roaming the seas and rivers. Now, obviously, raiding and pillaging...
That's a good way to describe it, because I have heard that even mafia gangs and things like that are not nearly as... In general, they don't kill as many people as you hear or as you see in movies and stuff like that, but part of it is just the reputation, and there's a lot of other stuff going on. And yeah, sounds similar.
Wasn't exactly rainbows and sunshine, even if it was exaggerated a bit, and the Vikings did basically control the slave trade at this time. But the picture we paint should use all colors. Norsemen were among the most learned of their peers at the time. They spoke multiple languages, had a higher literacy rate, and were instrumental with spreading faith and customs throughout the land. Among the first converts to Christianity were raiders and traders, and our days of the week to this day are still named after Norse gods. That being the case, their homeland was eventually Christianized around the turn of the millennium, probably advanced by the vast political and economic incentives. And around the same time, the beginnings of statehood were showing up too.
Now, I know that didn't Sweden embrace the Protestant Reformation? And so I'm sure that will come in pretty soon. I think Sweden was one of the big first adopters, besides Germany, wasn't it?
3 loose political entities came to be the most powerful: Ostrogothia, Westrogothia, and Svealand. Further south in Scania was at the time inhabited by the Stinky Danes. So as not to offend any Swedes, we won't be talking about them in this episode.
Stinky
Each of these
Danes.
kingdoms...
Is there a story there, or is that just a humorous thing? I mean, I'm sure there's cultural things like that obviously are in every culture, and so well, even in the United States, we have those things about neighboring states or neighboring countries, Canada and Nebraska to the north, our state to the north. We make fun of that, and so anyway, sorry, rabbit trail.
Had their own murky pseudo-histories that probably began in the Nordic Iron Age, but the Svea, or Swedes in English, surprise surprise, is what would eventually dominate politically, with its core around the strategic Lake Mälaren. Olaf Skirtkonung is believed to be the first king of a united Sweden. As a Christian himself, he, along with Denmark, made war on Norway, because these two kingdoms can't agree on much, but where they do is a shared disdain for pesky Norwegians. The Battle of Svolder was the Viking Age's biggest, as well as last, naval battle. Look it up sometime, it's an absolute riot. Now, when you're a Christian and can't go Viking around the continent willy-nilly, you have to find other ways to maintain a growth in trade. You gotta do it the civilized way now, and go on a crusade. Okay.
Yeah.
This is because taking land as a Christian comes with its own set of rules. You gotta use a flair for justification. And that means taking over lands that the Pope deems to be terra nullius, which is Latin for up for grabs. So Finland, Pope, Sweden, two birds, meet stone. Birger Jarl, a powerful region.
We also learned a little bit about that first crusade in the video about Finland, and so I'm really excited that he's going in depth and a bit more, because I was curious about that.
Of this period is also credited for founding the city of Stockholm and beginning the settlement of Sapmi. You see, the Gulf of Bothnia, this bit here, was where most of the lucrative fur trade originated. So by settling further north on the coastline, Sweden could expand that market, while the Sami do all the hard work of fur trapping. This became a loose bureaucracy known as the Burkals. Now, something curious about Sweden's monarchy is that it never developed into feudalism, and there's many theories as to why that is. The average Swede was pretty individualistic, like their Viking ancestors, and were resistant to overreaching of the king. They preferred him to be more focused on foreign affairs, like crusading, and what results is that the very core of the Swedish monarchy is one of expansion and not much else. Building an empire is kind of the only power you really have at that point. The king was far more like a CEO than a divinely appointed landlord like other estates of the Middle Ages. And if you're not renting the
That's a great chart. That really helps to... Interesting.
king's land, then you don't really have a way of instituting feudalism. So for the time being, kings just did what they could do and conquered more Finnish territory. Zooming out for a second, and you'll notice that Sweden wasn't the only one expanding into terra nullius. The thing about crusading is that it's just as easy for rival kingdoms to use the same justification that you're using for conquering more land. It's a free-for-all, unless you're a heathen, of course. Soon, Sweden was losing a lot of its trade strength to the Hanseatic League in particular, an alliance of cities in the...
The note there says, German-speaking merchants of the Hanseatic League, or Hansa, had a high degree of influence within the city of Stockholm, thanks to encouraging legislation by Birger Jarl and his successor, King Magnus Ladulås. I know I butchered that, sorry. At one time, German burghers made up more than half of the city council.
The Holy Roman Empire. I hope by now you can see that this was a major problem. Sweden's entire unity and monarchy as a state relied on that trade, and it could all come apart if they lost control, and cracks did begin to show. Magnus IV was elected of both Sweden and Norway, and was such a weak and ineffective ruler that he basically lost both of his kingdoms before.
Okay, we got more information here. So, Swedish-Baltic trade at the important Scania and Visby markets was completely halted during the late 14th century due to conflicts between the Danes and the Hansa. This was due in large part to the rogue actions of the Victual Brothers Guild, a marauding band of pirates initially hired by the Duchy of Mecklenburg to protect Stockholm from Denmark. Wow, this is getting interesting, complicated.
Or his death. And the system came under tremendous strain due to catastrophic losses to the Black Death. But with high population losses, this also meant that more Swedes were inheriting land, which may have been why indented servitude and serfdom never really took off. I mean, hey, silver linings, right? This brief lull in growth leads to a period I like to call the Great Danish Pause, which is neither a dog nor a pastry. The Danes were similarly choked by the rise of the Hanseatic League, so when Swedish nobles ousted their king, Queen Margaret of Denmark executed a sneaky plan. Unite all three kingdoms she controlled into one under a common monarch called the Kalmar Union, so as to better compete with the Hansa. Each kingdom could, theoretically, keep its own laws and customs while, theoretically, benefiting from the union. Win, win, win. But
let me guess, that didn't go quite that way.
the sneaky Danes actually had bigger ambitions over time, seeking to dominate the union, which made the Swedes break away in a series of rebellions. First under a noble named Engelbrekt, and then under a royal regent named Karl VIII. They returned when Christopher of Bavaria was elected in Kalmar, despite the fact that he liked to wear funny clothes. Christopher died a hot second later, so Sweden went in for a pound and just elected Karl instead. Karl was then ousted by a grumpy archbishop, Christian I of Denmark, taking his place. But they didn't think he was much better and asked Karl to come back for a second stint as king. He was then right back where he started, at war with the original archbishop who had deposed him in the first place. What came next? You guessed it, he was ousted one more time, invited back, and ruled as king a third and final time. As you can see, Swedish politics are a teensy bit temperamental. Karl left Sten Sture the Elder as regent after his death, and he became a Swedish hero when he repelled an invasion of Christian I. Later, Sten Sture the Younger, some relation, was defeated in battle on the frozen Lake Asundun by the forces of Christian II, some relation. When a group of the Sture supporters were then publicly executed at the Stockholm bloodbath, a son of one of the murdered nobles, Gustav Vasa, led an uprising that would expel the Danes from Sweden once and for all. And with that, the Great Danish Pause came to an end.
Wow. Okay, I think we're going to pause it there. Now, I am actually going to go back. I've got my handy-dandy notepad here. I'm actually going to go back and watch that first half again and take some notes and some questions, and I'll be back to ask you a few of those. Okay, I am back, and boy, that was a lot. And I've actually got 2 pages of notes here that I'm going through. And but man, it's so exciting to learn all this stuff. I've got questions for if you're watching and you want to share more. I loved hearing from all of you on the Finland video, and so I'm really excited to hear some of this stuff from you. If you've got some video recommendations on just learning about the culture in general, I'd love to hear about those too. So let's take a look. What are some of the most interesting aspects of Swedish history or culture, and maybe some of the most unique things that would be interesting? Is there anything in the video that you feel has been overlooked? Did Sweini skip over something that you think is important from your history? He mentioned that the culture of trade and free exchange of goods, and I assume ideas were also part of that, exchanging ideas. Is that something that's been kind of ingrained in your culture, much less of an isolationist culture, but more of a international type of culture? Oh, forest, the terrain. He said that there was not a lot of farmland because it was cold and there were forests. So are there still a lot of forests, or has a lot of that been replaced? By the way, if you've got some videos of great scenery from Sweden, I would love to see that too. He mentioned the city of Sakme, and I'm pretty sure that is where my maternal grandmother's parents immigrated from. So that was kind of fun to hear that. Is Sweden still a very individualistic culture? He mentioned that which is the serfdom or Sweden not becoming a serfdom. And so is that individualistic culture still very strong? And finally, the Kalmar Union, the independence, was that mainly political, or were there a lot of destructive wars and civil wars and things like that. War for independence that were fought during that time. So that's all I got from that video. I hope you'll join me on the next video, which you can view soon. And until then, see you later and have a great day.